Manhattan, New York, Danoy Restaurant on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. Saturday evening, June 13th, 1987. An upscale Italian restaurant that catered to both legitimate diners and to organized crime figures who conducted business over expensive meals, where the atmosphere was elegant and the service was discreet, and where certain tables in the back room were permanently reserved for people whose presence ensured that other diners would never be disturbed by anything they overheard, where mob guys could eat and talk and negotiate without concern that conversations might be recorded or reported, where the owner understood that accommodating powerful criminals was simply part of doing business in Little Italy in 1987. At a corner table in the main dining room, celebrating her 25th birthday with 3 friends from college, sat Victoria Gotti, daughter of John Gotti, who was by 1987 the boss of the Gambino crime family, someone whose name and face were nationally known, whose criminal activities were documented extensively by law enforcement, but who'd successfully avoided conviction through combination of witness intimidation, jury tampering, and excellent legal defense that had earned him the nickname the Teflon Don, because charges never seemed to stick despite repeated prosecutions. Victoria Gotti was dining at Danoy specifically because it was owned by family friends, because it was a place where she could celebrate her birthday without being bothered by people who might recognize her last name and either want to approach her because of her father's fame or want to avoid her because of her father's criminal reputation. Victoria had grown up understanding that being John Gotti's daughter meant living with constant attention, meant being watched by FBI agents who hoped to gather intelligence about her father's activities, meant being judged by people who viewed her as extension of organized crime rather than as individual person with her own identity, separate from her father's criminal enterprise. The evening was proceeding pleasantly, unremarkably, Victoria and her friends enjoying expensive food and wine, celebrating a birthday that marked Victoria's transition from student to young professional woman who was beginning to establish career and identity independent from her famous and infamous father. At approximately 8:45 p.m., everything changed when 3 men entered Danoy, were seated at a table approximately 15 feet from where Victoria was dining, men who were clearly not regular patrons of Italian restaurants in Little Italy, whose clothes and mannerisms suggested they were from out of town, who looked around the restaurant with the kind of aggressive attention that suggested they were evaluating the space for purposes beyond just enjoying a meal. The 3 men were members of a Mexican drug cartel that was attempting to establish distribution networks in New York. Emissaries sent north to negotiate with Italian crime families about cooperation in drug trafficking, specifically about using mob connections with unions and with port authorities to facilitate smuggling operations that would bring cocaine and heroin into New York through channels that Mexican cartels couldn't access independently. The men were named Carlos Mendoza, Rafael Santos, and Diego Vargas, all in their late 20s or early 30s, all experienced in cartel operations in Mexico and in southern United States, all believing that their cartel affiliation and their reputation for violence gave them status that would be respected even in New York, where they were outsiders, without established relationships or understanding of how local criminal politics operated. What Mendoza, Santos, and Vargas didn't understand was that Mexican cartel methods, extreme public violence, brutality that was designed to terrorize entire populations, willingness to kill anyone, including women and children, if such killings served strategic purposes, were viewed by Italian organized crime families as unprofessional, as attracting unnecessary law enforcement attention, as violating codes about civilian casualties and appropriate use of violence that the Italian mob had developed over generations. The three cartel members noticed Victoria's table, noticed four young, attractive women celebrating, made comments to each other in Spanish that assumed nobody nearby would understand what they were saying. Comments that started as observations about the women's appearance, but that quickly became crude and sexual, that escalated into explicit statements about what the cartel members would like to do to these women if opportunity presented itself. Comments that were intended as private entertainment between men who viewed women as objects rather than as human beings deserving respect. What the cartel members didn't know was that one of the waiters at Danoi, a young man named Anthony, who was nephew of the owner and who was working at the restaurant to help pay for college, was fluent in Spanish, had studied the language extensively, understood every word the cartel members were saying, and was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating crudeness of their comments about Victoria Gotti and her friends. Anthony approached the owner, his uncle Marco, and quietly explained what the three men at the nearby table were saying about Victoria, that their comments had moved beyond crude appreciation into territory of explicit sexual threats, that they were laughing about how easy it would be to follow the women when they left the restaurant, that they were making plans that sounded less like fantasy and more like actual intentions to assault or kidnap women they viewed as easy targets because they assumed nobody would protect random diners at an Italian restaurant. Marco listened to Anthony's report, his face showing increasing concern, and then genuine fear as he understood the implications, understood that three cartel members were making explicit sexual threats about John Gotti's daughter in a restaurant that was owned by Gotti family friends, that was located in Little Italy, which was essentially Gambino family territory, that this situation was catastrophic in ways the cartel members couldn't possibly comprehend, because they didn't know who Victoria was, and didn't understand that threatening or insulting John Gotti's daughter was approximately the most dangerous thing anyone could do in New York's organized crime world. Marco made an immediate decision. He couldn't confront the cartel members directly. That would create a scene, would alert Victoria to what was being said, would potentially escalate into violence that would traumatize his legitimate customers. Instead, Marco went to his office, made a phone call to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, asked to speak with whoever was available from Gotti's crew, explained what was happening at his restaurant, described the cartel members and their comments about Victoria Gotti, and waited for instructions about how to handle this situation. The response was immediate and unequivocal. Keep the cartel members in the restaurant. Keep serving them. Make sure they don't leave. People are coming to deal with this. Don't let Vittoria know what's happening. Keep everything normal until the situation is handled. Marco returned to the dining room, instructed his staff to provide excellent attentive service to the cartel members' table, to keep their drinks filled and their attention focused on enjoying their meal, to do everything possible to ensure they remained at the restaurant for at least another hour, to create no indication that anything unusual was occurring or that anyone was concerned about their presence. At 9:17 p.m., approximately 32 minutes after Marco's phone call, 4 men entered Danoi through the kitchen entrance, men who were recognized by staff as Gambino family associates, men whose presence meant that whatever was about to happen would be handled professionally and violently and completely. Men who'd been given instructions by John Gotti himself about how to deal with cartel members who'd made sexual threats about his daughter. The 4 Gambino associates positioned themselves strategically around the restaurant. 2 near the front entrance, 2 near the table where the cartel members were dining, creating containment that meant the cartel members couldn't leave without encountering men who were prepared to use immediate violence if the cartel members tried to resist or escape. At 9:23 p.m., one of the Gambino associates approached the cartel members' table, leaned down close to Mendoza, who appeared to be the leader, and spoke quietly in English. "You 3 need to come with us, right now. Quietly. Don't make a scene. Don't do anything stupid. Just stand up, walk toward the kitchen, and understand that if you try to run, or if you make any moves that we interpret as threatening, you'll be shot before you take 3 steps." Mendoza looked at the Gambino associate with an expression that combined confusion and the beginning of concern, understanding that something was happening, but not yet comprehending how serious the situation was, not yet recognizing that he and his associates had made a catastrophic error that was about to cost them everything. "Who are you?" Mendoza asked, his English heavily accented, but clear enough. "We're having dinner. We don't know you. We're not going anywhere with you. Leave us alone before this becomes a problem." The Gambino associate smiled, a cold smile that showed no humor, that made it clear he found Mendoza's response both amusing and irrelevant. "You made mutual comments about 4 women at the table behind you, explicit threats about following them, about assaulting them. You thought nobody understood what you were saying because you were speaking Spanish. But the waiter understood every word. And one of those women is Vittoria Gotti, John Gotti's daughter. So no, this isn't a request. This isn't negotiable. You're coming with us right now, and what happens after that depends on what Mr. Gotti decides. When he hears exactly what you said about his daughter." The blood drained from Mendoza's face as the implications registered, as he understood that the woman they'd been making crude sexual comments about was the daughter of the most powerful mob boss in America, that they'd been making threats in territory controlled by the Gambino family, that they'd committed the kind of offense that carried absolutely lethal consequences regardless of their cartel affiliation or their reputation for violence in Mexico. Santos and Vargas were also understanding now, their expressions showing terror as they processed what was happening. understanding that their cartel connections meant nothing in New York that threatening. John Gotti's daughter was effectively suicide, that within minutes they'd gone from eating dinner to facing execution by people who would show no mercy for the kind of comments they'd made. "We didn't know," Mendoza said, his voice now shaking, any pretense of toughness evaporating. "We didn't know who she was. We were just talking. We weren't serious. We would never actually—" "Stand up," the Gambino associate interrupted, his voice still quiet, but now carrying absolute authority. "Walk toward the kitchen. Move slowly. Keep your hands where we can see them. And understand that apologizing doesn't matter now. Understanding doesn't matter. You said what you said. You threatened Mr. Gotti's daughter. That's all that matters. Now move." The 3 cartel members stood up, moved toward the kitchen as directed, surrounded by Gambino associates, who would kill them instantly if they tried to resist, walked through the kitchen, where staff deliberately looked away because understanding mob business meant knowing when not to see things, exited through the rear door into an alley where a van was waiting, were pushed into the van and driven away from Little Italy toward a location where they could be dealt with privately, where what happened to them wouldn't disturb legitimate customers or create evidence that could lead to prosecutions. Victoria Gotti and her friends continued their birthday celebration, completely unaware that 3 men had been removed from the restaurant because of threats they'd made about her, completely unaware that her father was at that moment being informed about what had happened and was making decisions about how the cartel members would be dealt with, completely unaware that being John Gotti's daughter meant that even crude comments made in Spanish by strangers at nearby tables carried consequences that extended far beyond anything normal people would ever experience. The 3 cartel members, Carlos Mendoza, Rafael Santos, and Diego Vargas, were never seen again. Their cartel sent representatives to New York to inquire about their disappearance. Were told through intermediaries that the men had made inappropriate comments about John Gotti's daughter and had been dealt with accordingly. Were informed that no bodies would be returned and no further information would be provided. Were strongly advised that sending more representatives to demand explanations would result in those representatives suffering the same fate. The cartel, understanding that pursuing this matter further would mean starting a war with the Gambino family and with all 5 New York crime families who would support Gotti in any conflict involving defensive family members, accepted the loss of 3 men as the cost of their representatives' ignorance about New York's criminal protocols, as a warm lesson about the importance of understanding local power structures before operating in new territory. The story of what happened at Denoy on June 13th, 1980 is spread through New York's organized crime community. Within hours became legend that illustrated several important principles about mob culture and about John Gotti specifically. First, that family was absolutely sacred, that threatening or disrespecting mob guys' wives or daughters or children carried consequences that were immediate and final regardless of who was doing the threatening or what their organizational affiliations were. Second, that Gotti's protection of his family was absolute, that Victoria could go to restaurants and celebrate birthdays without worrying that anyone would bother her because everyone understood that even verbal disrespect toward Gotti's daughter meant death. Third, and perhaps most significantly, that Mexican cartel methods and Italian mob methods were fundamentally incompatible, that cartel members' assumptions about violence and about appropriate targets didn't translate to New York, where organized crime operated under different codes that had been developed over generations and that were enforced through swift, lethal violence against anyone who violated them, regardless of their reputation or their organizational power in other locations. The legend focused particularly on the speed of response. 3 hours from the initial comments to the cartel members' disappearance. 3 hours that demonstrated how quickly the Gambino family could mobilize, could identify threats, could eliminate problems before they escalated. 3 hours that proved that threatening John Gotti's daughter meant immediate death regardless of apologies or explanations or claims of misunderstanding. For Victoria Gotti, the incident remained unknown until years later when she learned through family members what had happened, how close she'd come to potentially being followed or confronted by cartel members who'd viewed her as easy target, how her father had ensured that threats were eliminated before she even knew they existed, how being John Gotti's daughter meant living under protection that was absolute and enforced through methods that were brutal, but that kept her safe in ways that no legitimate security could match. For the Mexican cartel, the incident became a cautionary tale that was told to anyone being sent to New York, a story about the importance of understanding local power structures and local rules, a reminder that methods that worked in Mexico didn't necessarily translate to other criminal environments, where different organizations had different codes about appropriate behavior and appropriate targets. Saturday evening, June 13th, 1987, at Denoy Restaurant on Mulberry Street. The night 3 Mexican cartel members made crude sexual comments about women at a nearby table, not knowing that one of those women was Victoria Gotti, not understanding that John Gotti's daughter was protected by organizational power that would respond to threats with immediate lethal violence, not comprehending that within 3 hours they would be captured and killed and disappeared so completely that their bodies would never be found, and their cartel would accept their loss rather than risk war with the Gambino family. The comments made in Spanish that the cartel members assumed nobody understood. The waiter who was fluent and who reported everything to the owner. The phone vendeur that brought Gambino associates to the restaurant within 30 minutes. The quiet removal of 3 men who thought their cartel affiliation protected them. The 3 hours between insult and disappearance. The bodies never found. The cartel accepting the loss as lesson learned. What happened next became legend not because killing cartel members was particularly difficult or unusual, but because of the speed, 3 hours from threat to elimination, and because of the completeness, 3 men vanishing so thoroughly that even their cartel couldn't locate remains or demand accountability. 3 men whose fatal mistake was making crude comments about a woman they viewed as random target but who was actually the daughter of the most dangerous man in New York. June 13th, 1987. The birthday celebration that continued peacefully, while 3 men were removed from the restaurant and taken to their deaths. The insult that crossed the line from crude commentary into fatal threat. The 3 hours that were sufficient for organized crime to identify, capture, kill, and completely erase 3 cartel members who'd made the catastrophic error of threatening John Gotti's daughter. The story that spread through organized crime as warning about sacred lines that couldn't be crossed, about families being absolutely protected, about John Gotti's response to threats against his children being immediate and final, regardless of who was doing the threatening or what organizational power they represented in other locations. 3 Mexican cartel members who made sexual threats in Spanish, thinking nobody understood. 1 waiter who understood everything and reported it. 1 phone call that sealed 3 deaths. 3 hours between insult and disappearance. 3 bodies never found. 1 lesson taught and learned about the cost of threatening John Gotti's family in territory he controlled absolutely.